I sat there quietly, the stem of my wine glass resting gently between my fingers as I swirled the deep red liquid. The chandelier above cast fractured light across the table, making my ring sparkle like it still meant something. Laughter echoed around me, sharp, arrogant, and pointed. The kind that wasn't shared, but aimed. So, another month without a job, huh? Bryce smirked from across the table, his Rolex catching the light as he sipped his drink. Maybe you should try applying at one of those little cafe carts downtown. They're always hiring, right? Max, seated beside me, laughed loudest of them all. That rich, fake kind of laugh he used when he wanted to be impressive. Who knows, babe? You might get lucky. Maybe someone will pay you to smile. I dipped my head and forced a shy laugh, like I always did. Played my part. Let them have their moment. I didn't mind, it wouldn't last. They thought I was humiliated. Powerless. Just a pretty, clueless wife riding on her husband's paycheck. That's what Max had turned me into, at least in their eyes. It hadn't always been this way. 7 years ago, I married Max Harrison, thinking he was the one person who'd love me for who I was, not what I had. I'd been building something in silence for years, and I wanted to see if love could exist outside power and money. So I told him I was a consultant freelance, barely stable, hustling. I wanted humility. I wanted honesty. I got neither. For the first year, Max had played the role of doting husband. Supportive, kind, even proud. But slowly, as the months passed and my public success stayed invisible, he changed. The warmth drained out of him. He didn't see a partner anymore, just someone beneath him. Just someone to keep quiet and look pretty at dinners. And I did. At least, that's what he believed. The 4 men seated around us, executives, all of them, smug in their tailored suits and monogrammed cuffs, were oblivious to the truth. Sterling Corporation, their pride and joy, their kingdom of deals and stock options, didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. My name isn't Evelyn Carter anymore, not professionally. That name was wiped from every document, every contract, every board record the moment I formed the holding company under a different identity. I'm the sole founder, the owner, the silent CEO behind the empire they thought they built. Max had no idea. As the conversation shifted to market shares and office rumors, I let my mind drift. 2 years ago, I started seeing the signs. Misused funds. Internal bribes. Kickbacks disguised as vendor payments. Max was too busy feeding his ego to notice I'd hired a forensic accountant and a private investigator. I wasn't just his wife. I was the woman quietly auditing his empire. He mocked me tonight like always. But the only difference was, this was the last time. I smiled softly, setting my glass down and glancing around the table. Each of them thought they were kings. But soon, they'd realize the kingdom had a queen. And she was done playing small. After that dinner, I stopped pretending. I already had the information I needed to begin. The last few years hadn't been about love or marriage. They'd been about observation. Strategy. I'd watched Max unravel piece by piece. Watched his charm rot into arrogance. Watched him climb the corporate ladder I built while forgetting who nailed the steps into place. It was time to take it all back. I hired the best. Discreet, brilliant, and untraceable. Investigators, analysts, cybersecurity experts. I embedded surveillance into Sterling Corporation's system through a dummy startup, one of many shell companies under my holding group. The systems they used for payroll, internal communication, and security, I quietly took control of all of it. Within months, I had access to everything. What I found made me sick. Personal expenses are buried under client meetings. Lavish weekends in Aspen are written off as training retreats. Harassment complaints are quietly buried or dismissed. And then there were the emails, threads between Max and his circle of buddies, filled with jokes about younger female interns, code words for bribes, and even hints of data sharing with competitors. Sterling, my company, had become a playground for corruption. But I couldn't just expose it from the outside. I needed to see it from the inside. I needed to feel what they made others feel. So I created Emily Brooks. Emily was smart, capable, with a resume crafted just enough to seem desperate for an opportunity, but not threatening. I made sure the HR department received her application. No connections, no recommendations. Just a woman trying to find her way in the corporate world. A week later, I got the call. The office hadn't changed much on the outside. Sleek lobby, polished marble floors, sterile lighting. But inside, the energy was different. Cold. Competitive in the worst way. I sat in the waiting room in a navy blazer, hands clasped, eyes lowered. I watched two male employees walk by and smirk in my direction, whispering just loud enough to be heard. Something about new meat. It wasn't subtle. Eventually, I was called into the conference room for the interview. 3 men sat on the other side of the table, direct reports to Max. Their faces held that same smirk I'd seen too often lately. The same one Max wore when he thought no one was watching. They didn't even pretend to be professional. The questions were lazy. He scrolled through his phone half the time. Another leaned back in his chair and stared at my chest when he thought I wasn't looking. They asked if I had any experience with high-pressure male environments, and then chuckled. One of them asked if I was planning to get married anytime soon, as if that had anything to do with the analyst role I was applying for. And then one of their phones lit up. I caught the name Max. He didn't even wait. "I hear she's cute," the guy snickered, reading the message. Max says, "Offer her coffee, not a job." The others laughed. I smiled. Not as Emily. As Evelyn. I gave them nothing but polite nods and let them believe they were the ones in control. They wrapped up quickly, barely shaking my hand, tossing my resume aside like I was invisible. I walked out without a second glance, knowing exactly what I needed to know. They'd poisoned the company from the inside out. And now I wasn't just cleaning house. I was burning it down. The next morning, I didn't take the service elevator. I didn't sneak in through the parking garage like I used to when I wanted to watch quietly from the shadows. No. That day, I walked through the main entrance of Sterling Corporation with my head held high and my heels striking the marble like thunder. Employees turned. Some stared. A few whispered. But most didn't recognize me. Just a sharply dressed woman who looked like she belonged at the top. I did. The receptionist looked up, startled, then checked her screen. My name was already scheduled in the executive calendar. As I stepped into the private elevator, I pressed the button for the top floor without hesitation. The floor Max used to brag about controlling. The boardroom was full when I arrived. Every seat is taken. Shareholders, directors, executives, including Max and the 4 men who'd laughed with him the night before. They didn't notice me right away. Not until I reached the head of the table and placed my tablet on the glass with calm precision. Max looked up, confused, then blinked. "Evelyn." "Good morning," I said, smoothing the sleeve of my blazer. "I appreciate you all being here." This is a shareholders meeting," one of the executives said with a forced chuckle. "Are you?" "Yes," I interrupted, locking eyes with Max. "I am. I'm the majority shareholder. The founder. And as of this moment, your CEO." Silence. Max stared at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. His jaw moved, but nothing came out. The others looked from him to me and back, unsure if it was a prank. It wasn't. I tapped the tablet. The wall screen behind me came to life. Footage, spreadsheets, audio clips. All of it neatly organized, time-stamped, and devastating. I'd spent months preparing this presentation. It wasn't a pitch. It was an autopsy. First came the financial records. Unauthorized bonuses. Reimbursement fraud. Lavish vacations masked as corporate expenses. Then came the surveillance clips. Disrespectful interviews, crude comments, HR complaints dismissed without investigation. And finally, the emails. Messages between Max and his team that detailed everything from insider trading tips to cover-ups. Max tried to stand. "This is insane." "Sit down," I said, louder this time. My voice was sharp enough to slice through the silence. One of the shareholders turned toward Max with a look of utter disgust. "Is this true?" Max stammered, grasping at any defense. "You can't just walk in here and—" "I didn't walk in, Max," I replied coolly. "I've been here the whole time, watching you." watching all of you turn my company into a cesspool. I turned toward the assistant at the back of the room and gave a nod. She stepped forward with a folder. Inside are termination letters, I said, scanning the room. Effective immediately. Max Harrison, Bryce Connors, Liam Wright, Victor Daniels, and Andrew Price, you're all dismissed. Your severance has been revoked due to breach of conduct, and your access to all internal systems is revoked as of 10 minutes ago. Security guards entered silently, standing behind each of them. You're out, I finished. Max looked around wildly. You can't do this to me. I already did. Employees lined the hallway outside, watching the scene unfold. Word had spread. Phones were out. Photos, videos, whispers. Max tried to shout, to protest, but the guards didn't argue. They just escorted him and the others out as the rest of us watched in silence. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. Justice didn't require celebration. By lunchtime, the story had broken. News outlets picked it up fast. Sterling Corporation's secret CEO exposes corruption from the inside. My face was on the front of every business blog, every finance headline. Some called me a corporate genius. Others are a symbol of accountability. Max, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale. He built his entire identity around a company he didn't own, and in the end, it rejected him like a bad implant. And I took back what was mine. The following week, I stood in front of the very people who made Sterling what it was. Not the suits who misused power, but the engineers, designers, assistants, analysts, and developers who'd been overlooked, overworked, and underestimated. I didn't stand on a stage. I stood on the same floor they did, microphone in hand, in the heart of our largest open workspace, where we used to hold team huddles before the company grew too bloated to care. I know many of you are confused, I began. Some of you may be angry, some relieved, and some are still trying to figure out if this is all a joke. There was a ripple of nervous laughter, but I'm here to tell you that it's real. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am the founder of Sterling Corporation. Silence settled for a moment before whispers took over. People leaned in, wide-eyed, stunned. For years, I watched from the sidelines as this company lost its soul, as the people who built it were pushed aside by those who didn't understand its heartbeat. I let it happen because I believed in second chances, and I believed that truth would rise on its own. But now I understand that sometimes you have to help it rise. I paused, letting my words settle. I've spent months listening to stories that never reached the top. Stories of harassment, of dismissal, of brilliant ideas shot down for no reason other than ego. That ends now. The next day, I cleared the house. I didn't just remove the obvious culprits. I dismantled the entire structure that had allowed them to thrive. The managers who turned a blind eye, the HR leads who buried complaints, the executives who rewarded loyalty to power over talent. I called back people who'd been unjustly pushed out. The first was Lisa Hall. Lisa was one of the brightest engineers I'd ever seen. 4 years ago, she created the core framework for our AI optimization platform, then mysteriously disappeared from the company. I later found out Max had made unwanted advances toward her, and when she turned him down, he engineered her exit. I offered her the position of head of AI on the spot. She cried during our meeting, not out of gratitude, but because, as she put it, she thought no one was ever going to believe her side of the story. I made sure everyone knew her name. We rolled out a new code of ethics, one written by a diverse team across departments, not dictated from the top. It was simple, clear, and bold. Integrity, respect, accountability, and every manager had to reapply for their role under this new system. We also implemented a confidential reporting system, completely external and third-party run. If someone had a concern, they didn't have to go through a gatekeeper anymore. They could speak freely. Mentorship programs began forming naturally, senior staff offering guidance to new hires without politics or favoritism. For the first time in years, departments began collaborating again. You could feel it. The air shifted. Gone were the stiff silences and the fear of speaking up. Instead, there was laughter in the hallways again. People were staying late, Not because they were afraid to leave, but because they wanted to build something together. Within 6 months, our stock price rebounded, and then soared. A Fortune 100 logistics company signed a multi-year contract with us after being impressed not just by our technology, but by our culture turnaround. Media outlets began running features, not just on me, but on the employees who made the transformation possible. Lisa was interviewed by Wired. Our lead designer was profiled in Fast Company. But the moment that stayed with me the most was a quiet one. I was walking past the break room late one evening, and I heard music. A small group had gathered, young developers and senior engineers, brainstorming around a whiteboard, laughing, sharing pizza, sketching something ambitious. They didn't know I was watching. And I didn't interrupt, because in that moment I saw it. Sterling had come back to life. Not just as a business, but as a place where people could thrive, dream, and speak without fear. It was never about power for me. It was about building something real. And finally I had. A year had passed. Max now worked behind a dusty counter at an electronics store in the suburbs. Blue polo shirt, name tag slightly crooked, eyes dull with something that looked a lot like disbelief. People didn't recognize him anymore, not as the once celebrated executive who bragged about bonus checks and golf retreats. That version of him had disappeared with the headlines. His second wife, someone he'd married quickly after I stopped playing the role of obedient partner, had left him the moment the money dried up. I heard she took the car and the dog. I wasn't surprised. His old friends? Scattered like dry leaves. Bryce was fighting off a federal investigation. Liam had lost custody of his kids after his ex-wife submitted the HR complaints as part of the court documents. Victor had tried to start his firm. He lasted 3 weeks before a PR disaster forced it to shut down. I didn't track them out of vengeance. I just didn't need to anymore. There was a time I'd fantasized about their ruin, about watching them fall as hard as they made others feel. But when it finally happened, it didn't feel like justice. It just felt quiet, like a page had finally turned. My focus shifted. Sterling Corporation had become something new, something better. And I had changed too. We launched a global mentorship program for women in tech, starting right here in our office. It was born from conversations with Lisa and dozens of others who once felt unheard. The program didn't just offer advice or inspiration, it offered real jobs, equity options, resources for growth. We connected high school girls with engineers, created scholarships, built incubators in cities that never got attention. That was the legacy I wanted. Sterling's European expansion came faster than expected. We signed a landmark partnership with a sustainability-focused logistics giant based in Amsterdam. Our AI platform would now power their entire fleet. Lisa oversaw the entire integration. I watched her present to international clients with command and clarity, her once muted voice now leading strategy calls and mentoring rising stars of her own. She'd become one of our most trusted executives. And a close friend. Late one Friday, I stood by the break room window, coffee in hand, watching a group of new hires gather around a whiteboard. They were laughing, debating ideas, and playfully tossing sticky notes like confetti. It reminded me of the days when I first dreamed of this place, back when Sterling was just a sketch in my notebook and a fire in my chest. This was never about destruction. Real revenge wasn't about bringing people down. It was about lifting what they tried to crush. About reclaiming something sacred.
Joy. Purpose. Autonomy.
Now, when I walked into board meetings, I didn't shrink myself or disguise who I was. I wore heels that echoed and took up space I once apologized for. No more fake smiles. No more shadows. Just Evelyn Carter.
CEO.
Founder. Survivor. And the builder of what comes next. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of everything.